So this is very important. Both Finland and Sweden moving much closer towards NATO membership. Sweden's ruling party, which is the Social Democratic Party, is paving the way for the Scandinavian country to submit a joint bid with Finland to join NATO. This is actually very important because Sweden in particular has 200-year history of military non-alignment on the European continent, which goes back almost, as far as Switzerland in terms of its reputation as a neutral country. And for a long time, they kind of pursued a strategy of strategic autonomy, specifically because they were caught between their cultural ties and business relationships with the West, but also their obviously geographical proximity towards Russia and their view as a place within a semi-traditional Russian sphere of influence, although obviously all these things have changed hands many, many times over the years. But you can't deny geographical approximation. Same, obviously, with Finland. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is that Finland is also set to apply to NATO, like I said, with that joint application. And Finland also, frankly, maybe the more provocative, I think, of the two, given the fact that Finland and Russia had actually fought a war before, back in the 1940s. This is somewhere where there's long been kind of a cat and mouse game between the two. People remember, the 1939 Winter War between Russia and Finland. And in Finland in particular, we saw this in the polling data. Most of their population did not want to join NATO before the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
They were like, listen, we don't want any of this. We see the Russians, they're crazy. We don't necessarily want to see any sort of thing like this. I think strategic autonomy in our massive welfare state, that's good with us. Well, what's really happened here is that, and this again, this is exactly what I predicted the day of the Russian invasion. I was like, what Putin has done is he has united Western Europe in a way it has not been united since the threat of the Cold War. And he somehow pushed neutral populations like Finland and Sweden who did not want to join NATO. They're like, all right, we got to get into NATO here.
Yeah.
So I think that, in terms of a strategic backlash against Russia, which the entire purpose that they say that they were expanding into or going and invading Ukraine was, oh, well, we have had NATO push up against our border, which is true. This is something where it's becoming a Western client state. We have to go in and have a military op integration to prevent this. Well, now you've invited these own democratic populations in order to try and join NATO. Now that's one side of the conversation. I think the other side of the conversation that we should also focus on is we also have a choice. There are 37 member countries in NATO. Do we want to extend the United States nuclear umbrella to Finland and Sweden? And this is going to be probably the most controversial part of this, and I know there are a lot of people going to be upset by this, but I think we should have a very serious discussion as to whether the US nuclear umbrella should be extended to Helsinki and Stockholm. We should really have a conversation around this. Does it mean that we should be willing to go to the brink and possibly past the brink of nuclear war in order to protect these far-flung borders, which are not even in Western Europe, but all the way to the edge and bordering along Russia? We already have that in the case of the Baltic states, in the case of Poland. Obviously, in 2008, we invited Georgia and Ukraine in order to join NATO. That didn't end up materializing, but that was a key moment within this. And now with the expeditious nature that this is moving, this is a conversation that we need to have in real time that we did not have in the 1990s and the 2000s when we extended NATO membership to the Baltic states, despite the fact that there were a lot of voices at the time who warned against doing so. And just to show you how bipartisan this is, go ahead and put this up there on the screen, which is that Republican leader Mitch McConnell just visited Kiev and he met with Zelensky, where he told him that he had the support for Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Now, why does that matter? NATO is a treaty, which means that you need 2/3 of the US Senate in order to ratify the new NATO treaty to allow these new countries into NATO. Now, obviously, I think a lot of the Democrats are basically on record as saying they might do so, but a lot of the Republicans, it has a relatively open question. There are people like Rand Paul and others, and we'll get to this in a bit, who had objected to the Ukraine bill, but he saying that the majority of his caucus supports this makes this a de facto conclusion that this is absolutely going to happen. However, there's also a geopolitical part to this, which is also kind of interesting, and there's a lot of reasons as to why this might be happening. Let's put this up there on the screen. People forget, Turkey is in NATO. It's under a dictatorship by Recep Erdogan. And Erdogan actually, despite previously telling the Finns and the Swedes that he was kind of okay with them joining, he's now gone ahead and said that he may be against Finland and Sweden joining NATO. He did not say specifically that he would issue an actual objection, because he would probably be the only country in order to deny doing so. But, this is also a country which is in NATO, which has done military trade with Russia. I think they have like an S-300 missile system that they bought from the Russians, and they have their own crazy relationship with the Russians given what's happening in Syria. His objections against Sweden and Finland classically have to do with the Kurds and the PKK. So it's, for domestic political reasons, he might be trying to force a chit from those two countries in order to allow them in. But also just shows you that if there is any opposition to this, it ain't happening here in America. I think that's a tragedy. We supply the vast majority of the arms within NATO. Recently, Europe, just so people know, only appropriated the EU 500 million euros to go to Ukraine. How much did we just approve? 40 billion. So that's 80 times what the Europeans are sending over to Ukraine. You might want to ask that question. I mean, we don't live in Europe. Last time I checked, it's a much bigger of a threat to their security than it is to us. I don't really know why we're footing the bill for the entire security of the continent. So I think this just masks look, I have complete sympathy for the Finns and the Swedes. If I were them, I would want to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. But we got to look out for what's good for us. And I don't think this is necessarily the best decision.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this would roughly double the land border that Russia shares with NATO, because Finland shares an 830-mile border with Russia. This is an extraordinarily significant decision in terms of overall geopolitics and in terms of the United States specifically. And it is being presented by the media as a fait accompli. Like you have no say, like it's a done deal, and also it's being done very casually, like this is no big thing. When, listen, ultimately, as we've said a million times, Russia and Putin specifically, not the Russian people, but Putin and his Kremlin cronies specifically are responsible for the unjustified invasion of Ukraine. It is wrong, it is bad. It was also completely predictable by our decision to expand NATO. Another thing that happened with almost no public debate. And this is why we have to push back on this anti-populist, pro-elitist way of doing governance, where they just present to you something like this as it's a done deal and don't worry your pretty little head about it. And we know what's going on here and we know what we're going to do. And, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are both on board, so let's go ahead. Are you ready to extend Article 5 protection to 2 more nations? Are you? And the fact that that question isn't even raised so that people can be informed by the news media is extremely, extremely disturbing. And it's a pattern, not just with NATO expansion, which we can now see has been incredibly consequential in terms of
no matter what you think
global security, right? But I mean, you see it with regard to Fed policy. You see it with regard to almost everything where it's just trust the experts. We got this. Don't dig into the details. We're going to present it as a done deal, as if there's no even room or space for public debate on the matter. And I think that is completely insane.
Yeah, I never thought I'd be this guy, but I have been increasingly appreciative of the vision of the founders, and what the things that they saw at that time was that we do not want to get entangled in a lot of these foreign alliances, that if we are to do so, given the destabilizing nature of American interference and quasi-alliances with the West and how that really shaped their worldview, it's actually crazy how little has changed, which is that the reason why they put that 2/3 majority in the Senate is they said this has to be ratified by a supermajority, 2/3 of the people's representatives inside the United States Senate, which should advise and consent. And we should also remember this. We have a long period in our history of rejecting international agreements, which our presidents and which the ruling elite at the time thought were great ideas, like the League of Nations and Lodge's 14 points.
True.
There were real Woodrow Wilson, people forget this, went on a stump tour of this entire country on the back of a railroad, on the caboose, stopping in town to town, preaching why we need the League of Nations. And then Henry Cabot Lodge and the Republicans went after it, and they had a huge debate. I mean, something we would barely recognize over an actual policy matter. And I am calling for the same thing on this one, because being just sleptwalk into alliances of which you and I and our children may have to all one day pay the price for is not something that we should do so half-heartedly.
Well, because the elites, it won't be their kids who are fighting and dying these wars.
That's definitely true.
I mean, that's what you have to keep in mind is, are you willing, or are you ready to send your sons and daughters over to fight and die in these potential wars for, Finland and Sweden? I mean, that's the core of the question.
Well, let me give the opposite. And so I had a big argument with Marshall over this. I'll give you his. I think somebody should give somebody should give the pro view, which is that it is likely inevitable that any war where Russia invaded Finland or Sweden is going to draw the United States in. And I think that's probably accurate, given the current state, especially what happened in Ukraine, and especially if our NATO partners like the UK and France and all of them were to get involved. And I kind of do think they would probably go to war if that were to happen, that the United States would then be dragged into this war, regardless, because of the current alliance system. So we might as well extend the deterrent factor to Article 5, to Stockholm, and to Helsinki. Not a terrible argument. I'll tell you why I disagree with it, which is that I would rather us get pulled in, kicking and screaming into a war for Helsinki and Stockholm than to have no choice over them. I want every single senator and congressman to vote. I want to send American troops to fight and die for the capital of Helsinki and Stockholm. And if they vote, so be it. I'll even sign up. I guarantee you that. If we go to war over those things and the people's representatives thing, I would be happily in order to stand in that, because that's something that I believe in. That being said, this is not that vote. And this vote does not carry the consequence that it should, of the height of there are Russian missiles raining down on Helsinki. Now, you can argue then that it's America's job in order to defend those two capitals, and I accept that. I think that's a fine, legitimate point of view, but I would much rather every single people's representative vote to send us all to fight and to die over there than to just have it just get backdoored Article 5.
There's two things there. Number one is the point you're making, which I think is really important, which it's very different a vote that's in the abstract, we come to their defense, okay, yeah, sure.
Right.
Versus, no, right now, are you willing to go and fight and die? I think those are two very different questions that land very differently with the American people, so agree with you on that point. I would also question the idea that it really serves as a deterrent versus as an irritant and an escalating factor. Because, I mean, the expansion of NATO thus far has not served as a deterrent to Russian aggression.
Yeah.
In fact, it has exacerbated made that aggression predictable and much more likely. Again, not taking agency away from Russia, the bad things that Putin is doing. So I would dispute the idea that this would really serve as an effective deterrent versus being yet another escalatory step. And in fact, what the Russian foreign minister has said is that they would have to take some sort of retaliatory action.
And that it would be a grave mistake.
And that it would be a grave mistake. And I think that we should take their words very seriously and consider what those consequences are as well.
Just because they're a military joke right now in Ukraine does not mean that they have an immense amount of force in order to bring to bear. And of course, they remain a nuclear armed power. I mean, look, I don't know how many times I have to say it. They have been beaten or they have been looked beaten and downtrodden and all of this many, 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 many times in their history. And they always come back in order to remind us that Russia really should not be underestimated. So look, I think, maybe we'll try to give you more of the all side of the debate. We're going to have somebody on tomorrow to talk about this in a bigger, grand strategic context, because I do think that no matter what, even if you do support it, these Finns and the Swedes, if you join, you better pay up, because I don't want to see those people, say, they have the biggest welfare state on the planet, which is fine, but why should we subsidize it? By supplying you all these arms and military equipment and we're backstopping the entire security of the European continent by 80 times more than they are. And they are rich countries. They have their own GDPs and national societies. So no matter what happens here, these people better be willing to pay, because it is not fair to our taxpayers, to our citizens, in order to backstop so much of their country.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.